June 4th, 1942 Midway Atoll, Pacific Ocean. The rising sun glints off the silver sea as a lumbering shape crests over the horizon. It's a Grumman TBF Avenger, still new, still unproven, its wide wings slicing through humid air like a reluctant giant. Inside, Radioman Third Class Harry Farrow adjusts his headphones, sweat pouring down his back as the crew braces for their first combat sortie. Below them, Midway Island smolders from Japanese bombardment. Ahead, a wall of steel and fire. The Avenger shudders under the strain of its climb, the drone of its Wright R-2000-600 engine barely masking the sound of distant anti-aircraft fire. The pilot, Ensign Bert Ernest, eyes his instruments, then squints toward the open ocean. Targets ahead. Stay sharp, he mutters, voice flat with tension. What they're flying isn't glamorous. With a wingspan over 54 feet and a profile like a floating barn, the Avenger is slow, heavy, and looks almost comical compared to the sleek Zero fighters it will inevitably face. It's a torpedo bomber built to glide in low and slow toward warships bristling with flak. Japanese pilots, confident in their speed and maneuverability, mockingly call it the whale. But today, Ernest and his crew are part of a desperate gamble. 6 brand new TBF Avengers rushed to Midway straight from the assembly line, are to make their debut against the might of the Japanese combined fleet. It's a baptism by fire. As they near the Japanese formation, black bursts of flak bloom all around them. The Avengers break formation, weaving erratically, trying to dodge the deadly shrapnel. But they're flying into a meat grinder. One by one, the new bombers vanish in puffs of flame or spiral into the sea. 5 are gone in minutes. Only Ensign Ernest's Avenger makes it back, riddled with 70 bullet holes, hydraulic fluid pouring out like blood. Radioman Farrow is dead. The gunner, AMM-3CJ Manning, is dying. The torpedo never released remains on board, untouched. To the Japanese, it's a laughable performance. These American whales couldn't touch them. Their carriers survived. Their pilots remained the undisputed masters of the air. A Japanese naval officer reportedly joked, "If that is the best the Americans have, this war will be over by New Year's." The joke spreads. Among the Imperial Navy's pilots, the Avenger is derided as a slow, obsolete brick. Compared to their agile Mitsubishi A6M0s, the TBF is a flying coffin too sluggish to escape, too large to hide, and too crude to strike anything that matters. Even some American crews, still attached to the older, lighter TBD Devastator, view the Avenger as an overweight brute. But they're wrong. Behind the ugly exterior, the Avenger is evolving and fast. What Ensign Ernest flew over Midway was the first step in a transformation that would turn the TBF into one of the most lethal killers in the Pacific. The Grumman TBF was designed not for beauty, but for survival and power. It boasted armor plating, a bomb bay big enough for a Mark 13 torpedo or 2,000 pounds of bombs, and a range of over 1,000 miles. More importantly, it was rugged. Unlike the fragile Devastators, Avengers could take a beating and still bring their crew home if barely. Following Midway, the Navy takes note. Improvements are made. Crews train harder. Tactics are refined. New versions roll out of Eastern aircraft factories by the thousands, rebranded as the TBM and issued to Navy squadrons from the Solomon Islands to the Marianas. By 1943, the TBF is no longer a joke. On Guadalcanal, Avengers destroy Japanese supply barges and hammer jungle airfields. At Kwajalein and Tarawa, they pave the way for amphibious landings with precision strikes. Pilots learn to fly them low, hugging the waves, releasing torpedoes with deadly timing. Gunners become expert at fending off Zero attacks with their .50 caliber Stingers. Still not glamorous, but now undeniably effective. The Japanese begin to notice. Reports circulate of American bombers that refuse to die, of carrier raids that leave destroyers burning and cruisers holed. Pilots who once laughed at the TBF now look twice when radar pings reveal approaching squadrons. The whale has teeth. And then, in October 1944, the Avengers' moment of reckoning comes. The Battle of Leyte Gulf. the largest naval engagement in history. Over 300 ships, 4 separate engagements. A showdown that will decide the fate of the Pacific, and within it, a confrontation between American air power and the pride of the Imperial Navy, the Yamato-class battleships. Among them sails the Musashi, sister ship to the Yamato, the largest battleship ever built. Over 70,000 tons of armor, 9 18.1-inch guns, and a crew of nearly 2,400. She is Japan's floating fortress, unstoppable, indestructible, and believed by many to be immune to air attack. And yet, it will be the slow, ugly TBF Avenger that brings her down. October 24th, 2024, Sibuyan Sea, Central Philippines. Dawn breaks through a thick haze of storm clouds and gun smoke. The sea churns beneath the American carrier task forces as they ready for battle. Above the water, in the bellies of Essex-class carriers like USS Intrepid and USS Cabot, crews swarm around the wings and bomb bays of a now familiar shape, the TBF Avenger. Flight crews move with mechanical precision, sweat slicking their uniforms even in the pre-dawn gloom. Armorers hoist 2,000-pound bombs and glossy Mark 13 torpedoes into the bomb bays. Radiomen run final checks. Gunners inspect belts of .50 caliber ammunition. Pilots, many barely in their 20s, climb into their cockpits with clenched jaws and steady hands. They know what's coming. The Japanese center force, under Admiral Takeo Kurita, has been spotted, and at its heart sails a monster, the Musashi. The sheer scale of the ship is difficult to fathom. The Musashi displaces over 72,000 tons fully loaded. Her armor is so thick that some American analysts argue she's practically unsinkable. 9 massive 18.1-inch naval guns, the largest ever mounted on a warship tower from her decks. Her anti-aircraft defenses are a living wall of steel and fire. The Avenger crews are briefed bluntly. This is their target. By mid-morning, the first wave launches from USS Intrepid. Among them is Lieutenant Jack Lawton, Jr., flying a TBM-1C loaded with a 500-pound general-purpose bomb. His gunner, Petty Officer George Meyer, loads the turret while their radio man tracks bearings from the ship's radar operators. As they climb, the horizon glimmers with Japanese ships, cruisers, destroyers, and at the center, the Musashi, like a black citadel drifting through fog. Kurita's formation is tight, but the weather is on the American side. Squalls and clouds offer concealment. The Avengers slip between them, unseen. At 10:25 a.m., the first attack wave descends. From high above, corsairs and helldivers swoop in to draw fire, dive bombing from insane angles. But it's the Avengers that come in low, dangerously low. Barely 200 feet above the sea, throttles open, hugging the water. Lawton's squadron breaks left, aligning their attack runs. Flak bursts all around them, filling the sky with black clouds and glowing shrapnel. The Musashi's anti-aircraft guns roar to life, dozens of 25mm cannons lighting up the gray sky. Inside the cockpit, Lawton grips the stick and dives. "Hold steady," he mutters. Just a little closer. The torpedo drop is a science of timing, nerves, and suicidal precision. At 1,000 yards, the pilot must release too early, and the torpedo may miss or fail to arm. Too late, and the aircraft will be shredded by fire. Lawton hits release. The Mark 13 torpedo slips cleanly from the bay and skips across the sea before slicing into the water, heading straight for Musashi's port side. Lawton banks hard flak, hammering the fuselage, and disappears into the smoke. Behind him, other Avengers repeat the same dance. Some are hit, some dive too deep, some drop too early. But over the course of the morning, Musashi is struck again and again. At least 4 torpedoes slam into her massive hull within the first wave alone, followed by several armor-piercing bombs that detonate across her superstructure. Still, she keeps moving. Admiral Kurita's radio operators send back a chilling report. The ship is damaged, but operational. Musashi continues forward. By 1 p.m., a second wave of Avengers arrives. These come from USS Franklin and USS Essex, carrying a mix of torpedoes and 1,000-pound bombs. One Avenger pilot, Lieutenant Harold Buell, later recalls, It was like trying to kill a mountain. This time, they focus on her starboard side. More torpedoes find their mark. One hits near the engine room. Another knocks out electrical systems. The Musashi begins to list. Kurita still doesn't order a retreat. By late afternoon, a third wave hits. Altogether, the Musashi will absorb over 20 aerial torpedoes and 17 bomb hits across the course of the day. Her hull is punctured in multiple places. Steering becomes erratic. Speed drops. Fires burn uncontrollably. At 7:35 p.m., the Pride of the Imperial Navy lists sharply to port and capsizes. She sinks beneath the waves, taking over 1,000 crewmen with her. The impossible has just happened. A fleet of aircraft once mocked for being slow and ugly has brought down the most heavily armed and armored warship afloat. The Japanese High Command is stunned. Pilots, engineers, and admirals alike are forced to confront a terrifying truth. Their invincible fleet is no longer safe. Not from guns, not from submarines, but from the sky, from the Avenger. Word spreads fast. American war correspondents are briefed, and headlines soon read. Giant Japanese battleship sunk in Sibuyan Sea. Back at sea, the surviving Avenger crews rearm and refuel, their hands still shaking, their eyes bloodshot. They don't celebrate, they don't laugh. They just prepare to fly again. The Avenger has earned its name, but the battle isn't over. At the northern tip of Leyte, another threat emerges. Admiral Gisaburo Ozawa's decoy carrier force is luring Admiral Halsey north, leaving the San Bernardino Strait dangerously exposed. Now, in the early morning hours of October 25th, the real trap is about to be sprung, and the Avengers, slow, massive, and full of vengeance, will be needed again. October 25th, 1944, just before dawn, off Samar Island. A ghostly mist clings to the water's surface, lit by the faintest glow of pre-dawn light. The air hangs still. On the decks of small American escort carriers, so-called jeep carriers, like USS Gambier Bay, White Plains, and Callinan Bay sailors, stretch, smoke, and sip black coffee. They are part of Taffy 3, Task Unit 77.4. 3, a cobbled-together group of light carriers, destroyers, and destroyer escorts assigned to protect General MacArthur's landings on Leyte. They think the worst is behind them. After all, the main Japanese fleet, Kurita's center force, had been turned back in the Sibuyan Sea after the sinking of Musashi. Admiral Halsey's massive carrier groups are far to the north, pursuing what he believes to be the main enemy fleet, a decoy force of Japanese carriers under Ozawa. But Kurita never retreated. Under cover of night, Kurita reversed course, slipping through the San Bernardino Strait unseen, undetected, and now sails south with a fleet of 23 ships, including battleships, heavy cruisers, and destroyers. Among them, Yamato, the largest remaining battleship on Earth. As the sun rises, lookouts aboard USS Fanshawe Bay rub their eyes in disbelief. The sea behind them, where no threat was expected, is suddenly filled with shapes, big shapes. Hulls, masts, towers. Enemy ships, bearing 011. Multiple contacts, battleships and cruisers closing fast. Panic flashes across the decks. These slow-moving escort carriers have no armor, no speed, and no real guns. Their air wings, mostly Wildcats and Avengers, are outfitted for ground support, not fleet defense. And yet, charging straight at them is a force that could crush them in minutes. Aboard the USS Callinan Bay, Lieutenant Commander Bruce Van Voorhis hears the alarm and bolts toward the flight deck. Pilots scramble to their Avengers, hastily strapping in, no time for full checks. Mechanics literally push planes toward the catapults. There's no choice. If they don't get airborne now, they die where they sit. Lieutenant Thomas E. Sadler, just 22 years old, lifts off in his Avenger moments before the first enemy salvos arrive. Giant water plumes explode around the carriers as 14-inch and 18-inch shells rain down from Yamato, Kongo, and Nagato. One shell punches through Gambier Bay's hull. She lists badly within minutes. The sky fills with the rising roar of propellers. A mix of TBM Avengers and FM2 Wildcats from Taffy 3's carriers form up hastily and turn into the teeth of the Japanese fleet. There is no plan, no support, only desperation and the knowledge that if they don't slow these ships down, every sailor on those flatops will die. Flying low and fast, the Avengers dive for the battleships. This is not how these planes were meant to fight. They're carrying light loads, 100-pound general-purpose bombs, or small depth charges, intended for Japanese shore targets or submarines. Useless, supposedly, against thick battleship armor. But they drop them anyway. And somehow, through sheer precision, courage, or perhaps just blind luck, some of these hits matter. A bomb punches through a turret roof. A near miss disables a rudder. Others distract Japanese gunners long enough for the destroyers to make their suicidal charges. Because it's not just the planes fighting. Below them, the destroyers Johnston, Hull, and Heermann charge straight at the Japanese fleet, firing torpedoes, laying smoke, drawing fire. Lieutenant Commander Ernest E. Evans of the Johnston famously orders flank speed and roars, "All engines ahead, we're going in." Above this chaos, the Avengers keep circling, diving, harassing. Some crews make multiple attack runs despite taking heavy damage. One Avenger is struck in the wing by shrapnel, leaks fuel, but continues its dive, releasing its last bomb just 300 feet above the waves. Another Avenger, flown by Lieutenant Wallace Dow, loses radio contact but stays with his group, relying on visual signals. His radio man, bleeding from a head wound, reloads the turret himself. None of these attacks are decisive. No Japanese battleship is sunk outright here. But the effect is profound. The Japanese gunners are overwhelmed. Their fire becomes erratic. Command becomes confused. Kurita himself loses track of his own formation. And then inexplicably he turns back. At 9 a.m., with the sea littered with burning American ships and smoke trails crisscrossing the horizon, Admiral Kurita gives the order to withdraw. The exact reason remains debated to this day. Was he unsure of American reinforcements? Did he believe Halsey was about to strike from the north? Or did the insane courage of destroyers and torpedo bombers convince him he was facing a far larger fleet? Whatever the reason, it is a miracle. The Avengers limp back to their carriers, or what's left of them. Some ditch into the sea. Others run out of fuel and are rescued by destroyers. Many don't return at all, but they've done it. Against overwhelming odds, outgunned and outclassed, the ugly torpedo bomber, once mocked as a whale, has helped save an entire task force. Historians will later call it the most heroic action by American forces in the entire Pacific War. But to the crews of the Avengers, there's no time for reflection. Fuel is low, ammunition is gone. But somewhere to the north, Halsey's carriers are chasing ghosts, and the real fight isn't finished yet. Continue to generate the next section. October 25th, 1944 afternoon, Philippine Sea, east of Luzon. The sea is strangely calm, eerily calm, as the sun breaks through the heavy morning mist. The water reflects light like molten silver. But aboard the decks of USS Essex, Intrepid, and Lexington, tension crackles like static. Admiral William Bull Halsey is steaming north fast. His fast carrier task force, the Third Fleet's mighty striking arm, has been chasing Admiral Ozawa's decoy carrier group for hours. Ozawa's northern force, hastily assembled with old flat tops and barely a handful of working planes, is designed for one thing: distraction. And it's working. Halsey believes he's heading into the final great carrier duel of the war. He's hungry for it. Pearl Harbor still burns in his memory. He wants blood, and he wants a decisive blow. But what he doesn't yet know, what none of the men on these fast carriers fully realize, is that they've been tricked. Behind them, to the south, Kurita's battleships have slammed into the soft underbelly of the American beachhead. Task Force Taffy 3, a patchwork group of tiny escort carriers and tin can destroyers, has been fighting for its life all morning. No one told Halsey they needed help. Until now. The first urgent radio messages break through around 8:45 a.m. From USS Fanshawe Bay, from USS Howell, from USS White Plains, all screaming the same thing. Under attack by enemy battleships, Need immediate air support. Aboard the USS Hancock, Flight Deck Officer Lieutenant Commander Sam Humphreys grabs a message slip and reads the impossible. Japanese battleships engaging our escort carriers. He stares at the horizon, then back at the fleet, steaming full speed ahead away from the battle. Back at the flag bridge of USS New Jersey, Halsey receives the same news. His Chief of Staff, Rear Admiral Robert Mick Carney, says nothing, just stares as another urgent report comes in. Enemy battleships in striking range of Leyte beaches. Request airstrike immediately. At 10 a.m., Halsey convenes a meeting. The fleet is still charging north, now within 100 miles of Ozawa's pitiful force. But the truth is beginning to sink in. Ozawa has no teeth. His carriers are bait, and Halsey took the hook. As the realization crashes over the command staff, one voice breaks the silence. Vice Admiral John S. WWII. McCain Sr., commanding the carrier group, says bluntly, "We must strike both forces, or we risk losing everything we've gained." Halsey finally acts. A special detachment of fast carriers is peeled away. Task Group 38.4 and ordered to reverse course and make all speed south. But it may be too late. Still, the pilots of the Avengers aboard Essex, Enterprise, and Franklin have no time to weigh strategic regret. Orders come fast. Immediate strike against Japanese center force. Rejoin Taffy 3 and support evacuation. Pilots who had just landed from northern sorties are rebriefed. Bombs are loaded again. Fuel tanks topped off. Some have only slept for 40 minutes. Others still have blood on their uniforms from earlier action. But no one is Itatis. Among them is Lieutenant Paul Stevens, a seasoned Avenger pilot who flew over Saipan and Palau. His crew, radioman First Class Ed Hensley and turret gunner Johnny Reams, move quickly. They've flown together long enough to skip most of the words. A glance is enough. They taxi to the edge of USS Franklin's flight deck. The signal officer gives the wave, and the whale rises again. As the Avengers roar southward, the sea below them glows gold. But they're flying into smoke, into reports of burning escort carriers, of men in the water, of ships lost. But there's also hope. Kurita's force has already begun to retreat. The unexpected fury of destroyer torpedo attacks and relentless Avenger dive bombing earlier in the morning has broken the Japanese assault. But there are stragglers, cripples, and opportunities. Just after 2 p.m., the Avengers spot their first target, Suzuya, a heavy cruiser that has taken a torpedo earlier and is limping westward. 4 Avengers peel off, their bomb bays open. One pilot, Lieutenant Mark Talbot, calls in the approach. Target in sight. Making final run. The bombs hit clean. One strikes just aft of Suzuya's forward turret. A fuel fire ignites. Minutes later, her magazines detonate, and she vanishes in a blinding flash. The Avengers reform and push on. By late afternoon, they've made contact with the retreating Japanese fleet. One group drops bombs on the Kumano, heavily damaging her bow. Another scores a near miss on Yamato herself, though the massive battleship shrugs it off and disappears into the mist. But damage isn't the point now. The point is pressure, harassment, vengeance. Each wave of Avengers keeps the Japanese guessing, turning, splitting up. Their formation, once fearsome and tight, dissolves into chaos. Radio intercepts reveal Japanese officers shouting over static, "Where is the rest of the fleet? Why are we alone?" By the time the sun sets over the Philippine Sea, Kurita's fleet has scattered. Half his cruisers are gone. His battleships limp toward the safety of Formosa, and the Americans, bloodied but unbroken, remain in command of the waters around Leyte. That night, the decks of the USS Essex are quieter. Pilots slump against bulkheads, some asleep where they stand. Flight crews move among the Avengers, counting holes, patching skin, replacing shattered turrets. One Avenger has 186 holes in it but made it back. And on the hulls of these planes, these ungainly beasts, the Japanese once laughed at the enemy's battleships left fresh scorch marks. The TBF Avenger had been forged in the fire of Midway. But here, at Leyte Gulf, it had become legend. October 26th, 1944, Philippine Sea, off Luzon. The sky is pale and bruised. streaked with contrails and drifting ash. The ocean, still littered with the wreckage of war fuel slicks, lifeboats, and charred debris, stretches endlessly in every direction. Somewhere below the waves, hundreds of men are still clinging to rafts. Some are American, some Japanese, none are safe. But up above, the hunt isn't over. In the aftershock of the Battle off Samar, one crucial reality remains. The Japanese fleet is fleeing, but it isn't gone. And the men aboard the American fleet know if even a handful of enemy cruisers or battleships escape untouched, they could regroup, strike again, prolong the agony. The TBF Avengers, their bellies loaded with torpedoes and 500-pound GP bombs, take to the air once more. No rest, no reprieve. Only the grinding rhythm of launch, attack, land, refuel, repeat. From USS Essex, Lieutenant John Connors leads a group of Avengers tasked with searching westward toward the direction of retreat. Each aircraft fans out across a 100-mile radius, scanning the sea for any sign of steel or smoke. The job is exhausting. The heat in the cockpit is unbearable. Radiomen and turret gunners switch off scanning duties, just to avoid going blind or mad. At 0932 hours, Connors spots a faint smudge on the water, like soot rising from the horizon. He taps the canopy and points. His crew sees it too. A surviving Japanese cruiser alone, damaged but still afloat. It's the Mogami, one of the heavy cruisers from Kurita's force. She had been caught in a collision with Suzuya during the chaos of the earlier battle, and was now limping back to safety with a broken bow and engine trouble. The Avengers circle wide and radio the fleet. 10 minutes later, another strike group joins them, a mix of TBF Avengers and SB-2C Helldivers. The American planes coordinate without hesitation, diving in pairs, flying low beneath radar arcs, approaching the Mogami from opposite directions. Flak erupts from the cruiser's AA batteries, still functioning, still firing, but it's erratic. Tired crews, low ammo, no fighter cover. One Avenger drops its torpedo from 900 yards. It skips once, then slides into the water, running deep. Seconds later, an explosion tears through Mogami's stern, lifting her half out of the water. Another bomb hits near the bridge. By 10:47 hours, flames cover her deck. Her main turrets cease firing, and then she simply stops. The cruiser is abandoned, and later that afternoon, the Japanese scuttle her with a torpedo from a nearby destroyer. Another piece of the once mighty combined fleet is gone, erased by aircraft, once mocked for being too big, too slow, too vulnerable. But the Avengers aren't just after warships. Reports from Army scouts on Leyte Island speak of Japanese convoys attempting to reinforce their stranded troops using transports, barges, even fishing trawlers. The Americans know they must deny the Japanese any hope of survival on the island. If they can't reach their men, the garrisons will starve, surrender, or die trying to hold ground. So the Avengers shift their sights inland and along the coastline. At Tacloban and Ormoc Bay, Avengers hammer dock transports. A pair of Avengers from USS Langley spot a supply ship hidden beneath jungle canopy, its camouflaged hull nearly invisible from the sky. But they see the glint of sunlight on metal and circle back. The first bomb misses. The second hits the deck. The ship erupts in fire. Nearby, Japanese anti-aircraft positions open up, spraying tracers through the palm-lined skies. One Avenger, flown by Ensign Howard Bell, takes a direct hit to its wing. Smoke trails behind it as it dips toward the trees. "Bail out," shouts the radio man, but Bell shakes his head and levels the plane. Somehow, he keeps it aloft long enough to reach open sea. They ditch just off the Leyte coast and are later rescued by a PT boat. Bell would survive, his Avenger wouldn't. That's the thing about these machines. They weren't meant to inspire awe. They weren't glamorous like the P-51 Mustang. They didn't turn on a dime like the Corsair. They weren't fast, sexy, or sleek, but they were tough. And over time, a strange affection grew between the men who flew them and the machines themselves. They began to trust the Avenger not because it was perfect, but because it kept them alive when everything else failed. One pilot wrote home, "She looks like a pregnant duck from the outside, but I've seen her take hits that would turn a fighter into shrapnel and still get us home." She's not pretty, but she's ours. By October 27th, the Avengers have flown more than 400 combat sorties in just 3 days. Fuel lines are stretched. Mechanics work without sleep. Bomb racks are being scavenged from damaged aircraft just to keep others flying. And the results speak for themselves. 1 battleship sunk. Several cruisers destroyed or crippled. Dozens of transports lost. Thousands of Japanese troops cut off. And the once feared Imperial Navy, humiliated and shattered, begins a permanent retreat. The torpedo bomber the Japanese once scoffed at has, in less than 72 hours, helped collapse an entire naval campaign. But the war is not over. Ahead lies Iwo Jima, Okinawa, the homeland itself. And the Avenger, born in fire, mocked in its infancy, will keep flying. November 11th, 1944, Ormoc Bay, Western Leyte, Philippines. The sky is choked with low clouds, and the scent of cordite, as another formation of TBF Avengers roars through the haze. Below them, the jagged coastline of Ormoc Bay is crawling with enemy activity. Plumes of black smoke curl up from bombed-out piers. The water is littered with the twisted skeletons of sunken Japanese transports. But it's not over. The Japanese are not giving up Leyte without a fight. Since the loss of their naval power at Leyte Gulf, the Imperial Army has been desperately trying to land reinforcements and supplies on the western side of the island. They've begun running what U.S. forces call the Tokyo Express, a nightly gauntlet of destroyers, barges, and transports attempting to deliver men and material under cover of darkness. The job of stopping them? That now belongs to the U.S. Army Air Forces and Navy aircraft, and at the center of that effort are the Avengers. Today, 4 squadrons from USS Manila Bay, USS Natoma Bay, and land-based fields near Tacloban are converging on Ormoc. Their mission: destroy the convoy before it can reach the shore. Lieutenant Harold Hal Jackson leads his TBM-1C in at low altitude, flying through flak so dense it looks like black snow. His gunner, Seaman Second Class Charlie Denton, scans for fighters while gripping the twin. It 50 seconds. So far, none have come. The Japanese air presence is crumbling. But the ground fire is relentless. Up ahead, Jackson spots the convoy. A cluster of rust-colored silhouettes moves just off the coast, 2 destroyer escorts, and at least 6 troop transports, pushing toward a makeshift dock under heavy camouflage. The Avengers split into 2 sections. One climbs high to drop bombs, the other swoops in low with torpedoes. Jackson pushes forward, throttling down to 150 knots. His torpedo is armed and ready. "Line it up," he mutters, sweat pouring down his temple. Denton calls out over the intercom. "You're good. 2 degrees left. Steady." At 800 yards, Jackson releases. The Mark 13 torpedo falls, strikes water, and disappears into the green chop. 8 seconds later, an eruption. The lead transport is lifted into the air by a massive blast, then breaks in half. Fire engulfs the center section as Japanese soldiers scramble to abandon ship. Some leap into the water. Others don't make it that far. Another Avenger drops a 500-pound bomb directly on the dockside unloading zone. A fuel truck goes up in a white-hot flash, sending debris and men skyward. Within minutes, the bay is a slaughterhouse. But not all the Avengers make it out. One, flying from USS Savo Island, takes a direct hit from shore-based 75mm guns. It wobbles, then crashes into the jungle beyond the beach. The crew is never found, and yet, the attack works. By late afternoon, 5 transports are destroyed. 2 are sinking. The Japanese landings have been delayed again. General Yamashita's reinforcements won't arrive in time to push the Americans off the island. Leyte is slipping from Japan's grasp. Back at Tacloban Airfield, mechanics peel burned shrapnel from an Avengers fuselage and count over 90 holes. The crew survive barely. One gunner, covered in blood, keeps gripping his weapon even after landing. They pry his hands off. He hadn't realized he was still holding the trigger. A war correspondent embedded with a Navy squadron writes home. "These big ugly machines, they're like war horses. Slow, snorting, impossible to kill. And the men inside them, they don't get statues. but they're writing history every day in the sky. By mid-November, the Avengers have made Ormoc Bay a death trap. Japanese ships begin arriving only at night. Barges attempt to slip through the shoals and jungles under moonlight. But even then, radar-guided Avengers now operating with nighttime navigation systems, and trained radar operators begin hunting them after sunset. This is new. The Avenger, once mocked as a daylight-only lumbering giant, is now flying at night. The TBM 3D variant, equipped with the AN divided by APS-4 radar pod beneath its starboard wing, becomes a deadly nocturnal predator. Pilots receive specialized training in low-light flying, and radiomen act as navigators, tracking enemy signals and convoy movements. At 0200 hours on November 20th, a radar-equipped Avenger picks up multiple contacts near the southern tip of the bay. 2 Avengers from USS Kitkoon Bay are dispatched. They find the barges creeping along the coast, engines muffled, lights out. The Avengers don't hesitate. Each one drops a pair of 250-pound depth bombs, not on submarines, but on shallow draft transports. The bombs explode beneath the keels, flipping 2 of the barges and setting others ablaze. By sunrise, charred bodies wash ashore. Japanese survivors stagger into the jungle. Their supplies lost, their weapons gone. It's total isolation now. General MacArthur's troops, bolstered by artillery, air cover, and logistics flowing freely through Leyte Gulf, begin tightening the noose. For the men flying the Avenger, there is no glory. No flybys, no ticker tape. Just mission after mission. Quiet successes that ripple across the war's outcome. From the skies over Ormoc to the shores of Luzon, the ugly duckling of carrier aviation is rewriting its legacy not just as a torpedo bomber, but as a strategic weapon, a force multiplier, a machine of precision and punishment. And as Japan's empire crumbles island by island, one thing becomes terrifyingly clear to those who once mocked it. The Avenger isn't done yet. March 18th, 1945 Kyushu approaches, south of Japan. A low fog clings to the water like smoke from a dying fire. The temperature drops. The sun rises blood-red through a veil of mist, casting long shadows across the deck of USS Hancock. Below, sailors in leather helmets and steel flight vests move through routines that no longer feel routine. They've crossed into dangerous waters into range of the Japanese homeland. Operation Iceberg is days away, the invasion of Okinawa, the final stepping stone before the expected assault on mainland Japan. But already, USS carrier forces are probing the edges of Kyushu, Japan's southernmost island, softening targets, striking airfields, factories, and harbors in an attempt to crush Japanese air power before it can interfere with the landings. And once again, the Avengers are leading the way. On this cold March morning, Lieutenant Walter Higgins steps into his TBM-3 Avenger with the stiff posture of someone who's flown through too many storms and flak bursts to believe in luck. His radio man, Petty Officer Carl Denson, gives him a thumbs up. In the turret, Gunner First Class Alvin Reese checks his twin. 50 seconds, then leans back waiting for the violence to come. They're part of Air Group 5, launching from USS Hancock, assigned to strike targets near Kagoshima Bay, a known hub for kamikaze assembly and refueling. This is not like the Philippines. Now, every flight is deeper into enemy territory. The flak is heavier, the fighters are more desperate, and the enemy no longer wants to stop the Americans. They want to die with them. As Higgins' Avenger lifts off, the fog thickens. Radio chatter crackles through the headset. Somewhere above, Hellcats and Corsairs form a protective screen. But below in the haze, the Avengers fly low, hugging the coastline, weaving between mountains and valleys that rise like the ribs of a dragon from the sea. At 0930 hours, the target comes into view, Kanoya Airfield. The base is still operational, and from the smoke trails rising above its runway, someone's launching fighters. Japanese Zeros. The Avengers break formation. Bomb bay doors swing open. Each aircraft is carrying a 2,000-pound general-purpose bomb, fused for delayed detonation designed to bury deep before exploding. It's not a surgical strike. It's a sledgehammer. Higgins lines up the runway. Tracer fire arcs past his wing. Ground gunners have spotted them. Reese lets out a yell from the turret. Multiple Zeros inbound, 9 o'clock high, but it's too late to evade. Higgins releases the bomb. The Avenger lurches upward as the massive payload falls. Below, the earth splits open. The explosion kicks up a mushroom of black dirt and steel. Hangars vanish in fire. 1 Zero is caught on the ground as its fuel tank ignites, shattering the aircraft into confetti. But they're not done. The Zeros swarm the American bombers not to dogfight, but to ram. The kamikaze era has begun. A scream of an engine pierces the wind. A Japanese pilot, in a battered, patched-up Zero, dives headlong toward the nearest Avenger. It's the plane of Ensign Gerald Mason from USS Bennington. His turret gunner fires a staccato burst just before impact. The Zero misses by feet. It clips the Avenger's tail, shearing off half the rudder before exploding into the trees below. Mason somehow keeps the plane level. He climbs out of the fog and limps back toward the fleet. Another Avenger, not so lucky, is hit square in the engine. The explosion sends it cartwheeling into the sea. These aren't air battles. They're collisions, suicide runs, madness, and they're just beginning. The American fleet knows Okinawa will trigger everything Japan has left. Waves of kamikaze planes will fall upon the invasion force like locusts. The only chance is to hit them first, destroy the airfields, cripple the fuel supplies, blind their radar. So the Avengers hit them again. Day after day, they launch from Hancock, Essex, Intrepid, Yorktown, and Bunker Hill, flying into the teeth of Japan's last breath. On March 19th, USS Franklin is hit by a Japanese bomber while preparing to launch a strike. Over 800 sailors are killed in a single cataclysmic blow. Dozens of Avengers burn on her flight deck before they can ever take off, but still they go back up. Ashore, Japanese civilians, factory workers, farmers, and students look up and see the low, wide wings of the Avenger passing overhead. To them, it is the shadow of death. Each rumble is followed by fire, by ruin. The once laughed-at torpedo bomber is now the harbinger of collapse. For the pilots, it's a war of attrition. There is no room for error, no time to rest. One gunner, Alvin Reese, writes in his diary that night, "We fly into a wall of smoke, drop a bomb, and climb out if we're lucky. There's no more cheering, just long stares. We used to laugh when someone told a story about a near miss. Now we just nod. Nobody is untouched anymore." As the fleet regroups and prepares for Okinawa, the Avengers begin flying anti-submarine patrols and convoy protection, a role they've taken on alongside their traditional strike missions. Their versatility becomes unmatched. One moment they're dive-bombing an airfield. The next, they're tracking sonar blips from enemy submarines shadowing the transports. They are the eyes, fists, and shield of the fleet. And as the American Armada turns toward Okinawa, its final and bloodiest battle, the Avenger, now veteran of every campaign from Midway to Kyushu, prepares to take on the kamikaze storm. Ugly, heavy, relentless, exactly what this war now demands. April 1st, 1945, Okinawa invasion beaches, Ryukyu Islands. The sea boils with ships. Over 1,500 Allied vessels, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, LSTs, and flat tops are packed shoulder to shoulder off the coast of Okinawa. It's Easter Sunday, and ashore, the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific War is underway. Marines and Army infantry spill out of landing craft onto sugar-white beaches under a strangely quiet sky. But the silence is a lie. High above, the first wave of TBF Avengers from USS Sangamon and USS Bogue patrol the perimeter. Their bomb bays are loaded not with torpedoes or heavy bombs today, but with depth charges and air-to-surface rockets. They're on anti-submarine and perimeter watch duty, scanning for signs of suicide boats, midget subs, and, more than anything else, kamikazes. Because the Japanese aren't waiting on the beaches this time. They're waiting in the sky. Operation Kikusui Floating Chrysanthemum has begun. Over 1,800 kamikaze sorties will be launched in the coming weeks. The goal is not to repel the invasion. That's already considered impossible. The goal is to drown the Americans in blood, to inflict such horror that they will hesitate before reaching Japan's main islands. And the Avengers are suddenly fighting a new kind of war, one that makes no tactical sense, where logic collapses beneath the weight of fanatical death. April 6th, 1945, the first wave hits. At 0745 hours, radar stations aboard USS Thetis Bay pick up dozens of incoming contacts. Within minutes, squadrons of Zeros, Vals, and Tonys, many stripped of armor and loaded with explosives, come screaming out of the morning Sunday. Destroyers open fire. AA gunners light up the skies. Corsairs dive to intercept, but some always get through. USS Bush and USS Colhoun, two radar picket destroyers, are struck within minutes. Flames erupt from their decks. Crews abandon ship under bombardment. Sailors burn in the water. And amid the chaos, the Avengers rise again. Lieutenant Charles "Red" Morrison banks his Avenger into the sun, his engine howling with strain. He's not chasing ships today. He's hunting shadows, planes, so light and fast they barely register before striking. Morrison's gunner, Second Class Frank Lee, opens fire on a low-flying kamikaze diving toward a landing ship. The Avenger's twin. 50 seconds rake the Zero's fuselage. It spirals, smoking, but keeps coming. Morrison swears, rolls in behind it, and fires an unguided rocket. The rocket hits. The Zero disintegrates in midair. The landing ship survives. Barely. Elsewhere, Avengers from USS Santee begin sweeping the southern approaches of Okinawa, striking kamikaze staging areas on Tokashiki and Karama Islands. They find hastily built airstrips, camouflaged revetments, and clusters of parked aircraft. No hesitation. 500-pound bombs drop in sequence. The earth shudders. Hangars explode. Japanese ground crews scatter, trying to push unarmed Zeros onto the runway, but the Avengers circle back, low and merciless, tearing up runways with rockets and machine guns. April 10th, 2025, USS Enterprise hit. It doesn't matter how big the ship is. The kamikazes find them all. One attacker smashes into USS Enterprise, the legendary Big E, forcing her to withdraw from the battle. Others hit USS Hancock, USS Bunker Hill, and USS Intrepid. Hundreds of sailors die. Entire squadrons are wiped out on the flight decks. The Avengers take to the air the next morning with new orders. Neutralize the kamikaze fields at all costs. On April 13th, a squadron of Avengers from USS Chenango targets Miyako Airfield, 170 miles southwest of Okinawa. The mission is risky deep into enemy airspace, beyond fighter cover, against a fully active base. The approach is quiet, too quiet. But as the first Avenger drops its payload, a wall of flak explodes around them. A shell rips through the right wing of Lieutenant Robert Gaunt's plane. Smoke fills the cockpit. The engine sputters. "Get ready to jump," Gaunt shouts. "No chance," his gunner replies. "We still have one bomb left." Gaunt dives nose vertical and releases the last bomb at 600 feet. It smashes into the airfield's fuel depot. The fireball can be seen from 20 miles out to sea. They crash land just offshore. Both survive, barely. That night, the crew is pulled aboard USS LCI 779. Gaunt is dazed, covered in fuel and shrapnel. He hears one of the sailors mutter, "That's the same plane they laughed at 2 years ago. Not so funny now, is it?" The Avenger had become more than a torpedo bomber. It was a kamikaze killer, a base buster, a ship hunter, a flying tank. It was the aircraft that could do everything, and survive doing it. And as the Battle of Okinawa stretched into May and June, a hellish, muddy, bloody grind of artillery, suicide planes, and jungle slaughter, the Avengers never stopped flying. In the final tally, they flew hundreds of sorties, destroyed dozens of kamikaze aircraft on the ground, provided real-time anti-submarine patrols, and supported troop movements with surgical rocket fire. But their greatest contribution was intangible. Presence. They were always there, low in the sky, engines groaning, wings wide, casting shadows over friend and foe alike. A symbol of persistence, of function over flash, of resilience over fear. They were, quite simply, the working-class heroes of the air war in the Pacific. July 28, 1945, Kure Naval Arsenal, Inland Sea, Japan. The clouds hang low and heavy over the gray waters of the inland sea. The winds churn with tension. Below, nestled in the natural harbor of Kure, lie the remnants of what was once the most powerful naval force in the Pacific, the shattered hulks of the Imperial Japanese Navy. But even in ruins, Kure is still dangerous. Anti-aircraft guns remain active. Submarines lurk. And within the skeletal wreckage, there are still targets that matter, warships clinging to life, desperate to fight another day. The Americans intend to make sure they never get the chance. At 0730 hours, from the decks of USS Yorktown, USS Essex, and USS Ticonderoga, waves of aircraft begin launching Hellcats, Helldivers, and at the center of it all, the Avengers. Among them is Lieutenant Commander James "Jimmy" Worth, a seasoned TBM pilot with over 40 combat missions logged since Guadalcanal. His Avenger, call sign Vengeful 204, carries two 1,000-pound general-purpose bombs, each one fused for delay, designed to rip through steel before detonating inside. He's leading a squadron tasked with one of the last high-risk bombing raids of the war, neutralizing the remaining ships in Kure Harbor, including the battle-damaged cruiser Tone, the carrier Amagi, and the heavy cruiser Aoba. As they approach, a thick wall of flak rises to meet them, orange blossoms in the sky, each one a spinning coin of shrapnel. The Avengers descend. Worth's voice crackles over the intercom. "Line it up, stay tight, drop on my mark." His radio man responds, steady but tense. "Roger, bombs armed, turret clear." They drop below 1,000 feet, almost suicidal at this range. Japanese flak crews are firing everything they have. Shells burst within 50 feet of the wings. One Avenger has hit its engine flames out. The pilot glides it forward and releases his bombs just before ditching into the bay. He survives. His gunner doesn't. Worth makes his run over Aoba. The ship lies listing, its superstructure blackened by previous strikes. But it's still afloat and still armed. 3 seconds. 2, 1, drop. The bombs fall like anvils. The first misses wide. The second crashes through the deck, near the aft turret, then detonates deep inside. Boom! Flames shoot skyward. The Aoba shudders, then rolls slightly to port. Her decks vanish under smoke. The Avengers pull out hard, climbing into cloud cover. Below them, the once proud harbor of Kure burns. Amagi is capsized. Tone is crippled. The last floating warships of Japan are, finally, sinking. Back aboard the carriers, flight deck crews erupt in cheers, but it's subdued. Everyone knows the end is near. They can feel it. And yet, the Avengers are not done. In the days that follow, they continue flying not just over Japan, but over the seas surrounding it. Submarine hunts, search and rescue patrols, bombing isolated radar stations, anything to maintain pressure. They know what's coming. Everyone does. Whispers of a new weapon, something called an atomic bomb, have begun circulating among officers. Most of the pilots don't believe it. Others do, and say nothing. August 6th, 1945, Hiroshima. The world changes. The Avengers don't fly that morning, not over Hiroshima. But from 200 miles away, aboard USS Bunker Hill, Lieutenant Walter Higgins hears the news. An entire city, one bomb. Silence. 3 days later, Nagasaki. And then, finally, the voice they've been waiting for. All Japanese forces have been ordered to cease hostilities. Prepare to stand down. August 15th, 1945, victory. The war is over. The Avengers, the workhorses of the Pacific, taxi to a halt for the last time. Their engines sputter into silence. Deck crews lean against their wings, stunned. Some smile. Others cry. A few walk the flight decks, touching the scorched fuselages, the patched-over bullet holes, the names scrawled in chalk near the nose cones. Ruthless. Tokyo Taxi. Debbie's debt. So many of them had carried crews who never returned. On USS Cowpens, An Avenger with no squadron markings sits alone on the flight deck. Its pilot died at Leyte. Its crew never replaced. The mechanics never repainted it. It's left there, a silent memorial. Aboard USS Enterprise, a final squadron of Avengers flies one last ceremonial lap over the deck before landing. Their bomb bays are empty. For the first time in years, they carry no payload, only peace. And yet, the legacy of the TBF Avenger is etched deeper than any single campaign. It flew at Midway, where it was nearly destroyed. It flew at Guadalcanal, where it sank Japanese destroyers under cover of jungle storms. It flew at Leyte, where it crippled the Musashi and drove off the largest battleship fleet ever assembled. It flew at Okinawa, where it faced the flame and steel of kamikazes. And it flew over Japan, when no other plane dared to go that low, that slow and still come back. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't fast, but it did everything. More than 7,500 were built. Thousands of enemy ships, planes, and bases destroyed. And in the end, those who mocked it died by it. The Japanese pilots who once laughed at the Avengers' waddling takeoff, who joked that it was a flying whale, too slow to survive, had watched it rise, again and again, through storm and shrapnel, until there was nothing left to shoot it down. September 2nd, 1945, Tokyo Bay. Aboard the USS Missouri. The sea is still. The war is over. On the deck of the USS Missouri, General Douglas MacArthur signs the instrument of surrender. Across from him stands Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu and General Yoshijiro Umezu, representing a defeated empire. Around them, sailors stand at attention. Cameras whir, and flags ripple in the wind, not with triumph, but with solemnity. Anchored nearby is a carrier USS San Jacinto. From her deck just a year prior, a young pilot named George H.W. Bush had flown his Avenger into Japanese flak to attack a radio tower on Chichijima. He was shot down, rescued at sea, and returned to fly again. Thousands of others weren't so lucky. The war is over, but the aircraft that helped end it still sits quietly in the hangars, oil cooling, wings folded like the pages of a book that took too long to close. The TBF Avenger, the aircraft no one wanted to love, but everyone came to depend on. As the fleet disperses and begins the long voyage home, the Avenger's role changes again. Some are converted into trainers, others become transport craft or target tugs. A few remain in naval reserve squadrons. But most battle-scarred, patched, and oil-streaked are retired, rolled into hangars, or scrapped entirely. There are no grand retirement parades for the Avenger, no songs written, no soaring tributes. But among those who flew them, who repaired them, who owed their lives to their stubborn durability, there is reverence. Because the numbers told only half the story. More than 7,546 TBF and TBM Avengers were built from 1,941 to 1,945. Of those, thousands flew in every theater of the Pacific War. They were the first American aircraft to strike back after Pearl Harbor in serious force, the first to drop torpedoes at Midway, the last to strike Japanese ports before the surrender. They sank more Japanese shipping tonnage than any other aircraft in the war. But that's not what made them matter. It was what they endured. At Midway, they were thrown into battle too early and paid in blood. At Guadalcanal, they learned the jungle as well as the sea. At Tarawa, they flew under monsoon skies, soaking wet and blind, and still delivered payloads. At Leyte, they cracked the Musashi in half. At Okinawa, they flew through suicide squadrons. And in Japan, they turned shipyards and airfields into graveyards. They did all this with a crew of 3 pilot, turret gunner, and radio man. In a war filled with machines built to dazzle Mustangs with silver fuselages, Corsairs with bent wings, Lightnings with twin booms, the Avenger remained unflashy, steady, deadly, reliable. And perhaps no aircraft symbolized the quiet, grinding, unglamorous work of victory better than it. A generation of men climbed into that rolling tank of steel and flew into hell with nothing but belief in its armor and each other. They called it names: Pregnant Beast, Iron Whale, The Bus, Some cursed it. Others kissed the wings before takeoff. But all of them came to trust it, because it brought them home again and again when nothing else could. In the years after the war, the Avenger lived on. Some were used by Canada for anti-submarine patrols during the Cold War. Others went to civilian duty, crop dusting, firebombing, even mail delivery. A few wound up in museums. A handful still fly today in air shows, their big radial engines roaring, black smoke curling as they make low passes over cheering crowds who may not know what they're seeing, but feel the weight of history anyway. And the pilots? They never forgot. Many returned home quietly, became farmers, shopkeepers, fathers, engineers. Some bore scars you couldn't see. Some never talked about the war at all, but now and then in a reunion hall, a hangar, or over coffee in a VFW, one might lean back, eyes distant, and say, "I flew an Avenger once." And anyone who heard those words and knew what that meant would nod in quiet understanding. Because it wasn't just a plane. It was a workhorse, a war machine, a coffin, a lifeboat, a miracle. It was the shape of vengeance, cast in aluminum and fire. And for those Japanese pilots who once laughed at it, who mocked its chubby fuselage and sluggish turn, the war ended not with laughter, but with the low rumble of 3 blades cutting through the clouds. A sound that meant death. A sound that meant America was coming. A sound they would never outrun. The TBF Avenger was never supposed to be remembered. And yet, it never left history's sky.